Before the gleam of the crowns, before the golden eagles marched through conquered cities, there was a muffled sound that echoed among the rubble of Europe. The sound of bones being broken. Bones of young men, sent as disposable pieces for the game of an emperor. This video is not about Napoleon as a military genius. It's not about your grand victories or emblematic defeats. This is a dive into the shadows, into the open veins of history where blood never dried. You are about to experience the hidden side of the Napoleonic Wars, where glory turns to dust, and true heroes lie forgotten under layers of mud, snow, and silence. At the end of the 18th century, Europe burned like a furnace. The French Revolution had toppled kings, decapitated nobles, and promised a new era of liberty. But from the ashes of that promise, something darker emerged, a specter of conquest, an insatiable appetite for power. And at the heart of that storm arose Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who understood the fears and hopes of a traumatized nation. He didn't just see opportunity, he embodied destiny. With calculated words and an almost hypnotic presence, Napoleon began to sow the greatest lie of his empire, the glory of war in crowded taverns, bustling squares filled with the hungry poor, and fields forgotten by the Republic. Emissaries of the new regime distributed pamphlets. Humble men, boys of 16 or 17, read or listened to golden promises, respect, honor, riches looted from foreign lands, a new uniform, a gleaming musket, a place among the homeland's heroes. It was a seductive narrative, surgically crafted. For manipulation, it was the myth of the soldier as sacred martyr. But behind the fresh ink of the posters lurked a machine of destruction. The first regiments sent to the Italian campaign, under the command of the young Corsican general, soon learned the truth. The mountain roads bore no flowers, only makeshift mines and treacherous ambushes. Hunger was constant, boots disintegrated after days of marching, and the promised provisions never arrived. Those who fell during the journey, victims of disease or exhaustion, were abandoned by the roadside, piled like firewood. The night's cold froze them in expressions of agony. Even the living dragged themselves like the dead. This was not righteous warfare, it was massacre, dehumanization. Yet Napoleon understood the power of aesthetics. He sent artists to depict the battlefields as epic triumphs. Death was painted in poetry, as if carnage were a ritual of national purification. In French cities, families received condolence letters, penned by paid scribes, each filled with mechanical, standardized words. None spoke the truth, that many died, not knowing why. Villages around battlefields were looted by both enemy armies and Napoleon's own troops. It was common for peasant women to be raped, barns set ablaze, and animals slaughtered, not out of need, but frustration. Those who resisted, even civilians, were treated as spies and summarily executed. A veil of silence shrouded these actions. Officers who dared denounce such abuses vanished into military bureaucracy. But the lie of glory needed constant maintenance. Napoleon built a propaganda machine that infiltrated popular culture songs, theater plays, sermons from complicit priests. Everything reinforced the idea that dying for the emperor was a privilege. It was the rebirth of blind faith. This time, replacing God with a man of flesh, ambition, and bloodied hands. Orphans were gathered into military schools and indoctrinated from an early age. They didn't grow up dreaming of freedom, but of dying for France. Or rather, for Napoleon. One emblematic example was the Egyptian campaign. Promoted as a scientific and civilizing expedition, it revealed itself as a journey of horror. Soldiers faced tropical diseases, scorpions, relentless ambushes, and a population that despised them. Bodies swelled under the scorching sun, and rivers ran red. Campaign doctors reported collective deliriums, outbreaks of madness, and mass suicides. Many soldiers surrendered themselves to the enemy, just to end it all. Yet in France, the campaign was sold as a victory. The truth became unrecognizable, and while Napoleon crowned himself emperor, an image frozen in painting, but alive in the collective unconscious, thousands of bones already formed a new, invisible foundation beneath the empire. bones of deceived men, forgotten, stacked. In the mass graves of history, the initial lie, the call to glory, was not merely a military strategy, it was a doctrine. A pagan religion built on blood. And like all fanatical religions, it demanded sacrifices. Thousands of them.
War shapes bodies like a sculptor shapes stone, with brutal strikes and definitive cuts. The Napoleonic soldier, so glorified in paintings and songs, was, in reality, a biological machine on the verge of collapse. It wasn't bullets that killed the most. It was hunger, cold, fever, and fear. Marching for days under hailstorms, carrying backpacks that broke spines, and hearing cannons roaring in the distance like omens of death created a pain that settled in the bones and the soul. It was the beginning of the abyss. Boots tore the flesh off heels, creating wounds that festered within hours. Pus dripped down to the ankles, mixed with blood and urine. Feet became living blisters, and those who insisted on marching collapsed in the snow. Double amputations were common. Surgeons often used carpentry saws without anesthesia, with screams muffled by bloodied rags. Those who didn't scream went insane. Tents were miniature hells. Humidity bred fungus. Lice devoured scalps. Rats chewed on the fingers of sleeping soldiers. Diseases like typhus, scurvy, and dysentery spread faster than any enemy army. Constant diarrhea dehydrated men in hours, leaving sunken eyes, yellowing skin, and bones protruding under flaccid flesh. It was the body shutting down. A slow, silent, cruel process. Food was scarce and rotten. Rations often consisted of spoiled dried meat, worm-infested biscuits, and a bit of sour wine. Many soldiers ate dirt, tree bark, or tried boiling leather. Those who stole from others were lynched at night by their own comrades. There was no honor left, only brutal survival. One officer wrote, "I saw a man strangle his best friend for a spoon of soup, and then, in tears, drink the warm blood from the corpse." But it wasn't just the body that broke. It was the mind. War is a factory of trauma. Nightmares were constant. Men woke up screaming, drenched in sweat, convinced they were being stabbed by invisible bayonets. Hallucinations during the day were also common. Many spoke to dead relatives. Others sat silently for hours, staring into the void. These men, labeled unstable, were cast aside, not out of compassion, but because their madness threatened morale. They were left behind, sometimes with a vial of gunpowder and instructions to solve the problem. On the battlefield, hell took visual form, severed arms hanging from branches, heads crushed under cannon wheels, eyes plucked by still-living crows. The screams never stopped. The smell of burnt flesh, gunpowder, and human excrement formed a nauseating cloud that filled lungs and soaked into skin. Many soldiers had seizures after close explosions. Survivors often went blind, deaf, or were paralyzed by untreated trauma. Veterans were feared. Back in France, their physical scars made them pariahs. Many wandered the streets as beggars, trembling, mumbling in delirium. Others isolated themselves completely, unable to live among civilians. There are records of soldiers who buried themselves alive, digging holes where they spent entire days hiding, reliving battles in their minds. One in Toulouse murdered his entire family, writing on the walls in his own blood, "They were Austrians in disguise. I saved them." There were no rewards for these men. Many never received pensions. Those who lost limbs were given makeshift crutches and forgotten in foul-smelling asylums, treated as burdens. The promised glory evaporated like steam from hot. Blood spilled on snow. Napoleon never saw the piles of bodies after battles. But they saw him, in statues, coins, portraits, always clean, majestic, eternal. The true face of the Napoleonic soldier was not that of a hero. It was that of a martyr without a cause, a shredded body, a shattered mind, always marching forward, unsure if legs still carried them, marching like automatons, like phantoms trapped between life and death, unaware of where the road ended. Because the cruel truth was this: to Napoleon, they were all expendable, and the abyss, that bottomless abyss, was dug, day after day, by the very feet of the soldiers who never returned. The 1812 Russian campaign wasn't a battle. It was a continental-scale sacrifice. Napoleon, drunk on visions of invincibility, decided to march into the frozen heart of the largest territory in Europe, with an army of over 600,000 men. But what many still fail to understand is that this campaign was never a military invasion. It was a procession into the abyss, where each step forward was also a step toward madness, physical collapse, and the moral disintegration of humanity itself. From the outset, everything went wrong. The scorching Russian summer drained the soldiers' strength. The dry, thick dust clung to their skin and infiltrated their lungs. Water was scarce, often contaminated. Animals collapsed from thirst. Men fell sick with severe intestinal infections, vomiting blood, defecating standing up, and dragging their wasted bodies forward. And still, that was only the beginning. The Russians employed a brutal, effective tactic. They retreated without fighting, burning villages, crops, wells, and any structure that could offer shelter. It was scorched earth. Napoleon's soldiers were not fighting visible enemies. They fought hunger, despair, and time itself. In Russia, time isn't measured in hours. It's measured in lives. Entire cities burned on the horizon, and beyond, the smoke. Absolute silence. It was a war against ghosts. When they finally reached Moscow, the city had already been evacuated and set ablaze. All that remained was the smell of smoke, blackened walls, and the sound of rats. Napoleon waited for a surrender that never came. For weeks, the army remained idle, frozen by the emperor's indecision and by the dropping temperatures. The Russian winter, that ancient merciless god, began its harvest. The first snow fell, quietly, almost poetically. But within nights, the temperatures plunged to 20-degree Yang. Uniforms tore in the wind. Toes blackened and gangrened. Horses died by the hundreds, their carcasses becoming foul bedding. Starving men turned to unimaginable acts, boiling boot leather, chewing leather belts. When that failed, they began looking at each other differently. Human flesh became a resource. Yes, there was cannibalism, and not isolated cases. Documents, hidden for centuries, describe entire units roasting the flesh of dead comrades. In some cases, wounded men were killed intentionally to feed the stronger ones. Instinct replaced morality. The line between human and beast dissolved in the snow. During the retreat, the real horror began. The march back wasn't a military withdrawal. It was an exodus of living corpses. Men without boots, feet wrapped in bloody rags, crawled. The fallen were abandoned. Officers at times ordered the wounded thrown into frozen lakes to ease the caravan's burden. A French major wrote, "Nothing matters but walking. Stop, and you die. Cry, and you die. Turn back, and you die." The landscape became a white graveyard. Crows and wolves followed the army like ceremonial vultures. At night, their howls mingled with the feverish mutterings of the soldiers. Many took their own lives. Others plunged into icy rivers to escape the agony of necrotic limbs. Some laughed for minutes after discovering their feet were gone, dying in frozen embrace with insanity. Napoleon abandoned the army mid-retreat. He left in a sled, protected, wrapped in furs, escorted by his personal guard. The remnants, now less than 10% of the original force, trudged on through blizzards and corpse-strewn valleys. When they finally crossed the border, they were no longer soldiers. They were shadows, walking skeletons, living witnesses of a silent apocalypse. In censored letters, some survivors wrote, "Russia is not a country, it is a demon, a labyrinth of death. Whoever enters does not leave, and if they leave, they're never the same." These men were never recognized, No statues were raised, no songs were written. They were erased from history as an inconvenient error, a shame too grotesque to romanticize, but the bones remain. Even today, archaeologists find frozen skeletons curled in fetal positions, clutching letters, medals, or petrified scraps of bread. Ghosts that no one exorcised. Their stories were never told. But they are here, in these words, whispering between the lines. They want to be remembered. They need to be remembered. It wasn't only soldiers who bled at Napoleon's hands. Behind the battle lines, hidden by the roar of cannons and the smoke of burning fields, were the silent victims, civilians, women, children, the elderly, peasants dragged into wars. They never chose. Entire populations saw their lives collapse without ever understanding why. When the imperial army advanced, it did not do so as a liberator. Despite rhetoric of civilization and progress, what arrived was chaos. Villages were looted, granaries plundered, convents desecrated. Hungry soldiers turned homes into camps, and the bodies of dead civilians lay in backyards like garbage. Any suspicion of resistance was punished with brutality. Public executions, mass rape, torture as intimidation. Napoleon's wars starved entire cities. Fields couldn't be harvested. Trade routes were severed. Children died in the arms of mothers who hadn't eaten in days. In Portugal and Spain, reports speak of villages where residents were locked inside churches and burned alive in retaliation for harboring deserters. In one documented case from 1810, 86 people, mostly women and elderly, died suffocated in a church of a village that never existed again. Hunger became an invisible weapon. A siege that lasted months. In many parts of Prussia, even Napoleon's allies feared him. Troops requisitioned supplies without payment, raided depots, destroyed crops to feed their horses. Then they left, leaving behind deserts. Survivors bore the marks of misery, teeth lost from malnutrition, infectious diseases rampaging unchecked, epidemics crushing populations already near collapse. And there were orphans. Thousands of them, dragging themselves along muddy roads, sleeping in abandoned stables, learning to steal before they learned to read. Many were kidnapped by flesh merchants and sold into servitude or slavery in war's shadow markets. Others were taken by regiments and forced to serve as mascots, uniformed children, trained to carry ammunition, polish boots, serve wine. Some saw their siblings shot by drunken soldiers. Others were raped. None were remembered. In urban centers, propaganda transformed reality into myth. Paris became an island of comfortable ignorance. Artists produced heroic engravings. Bookstores sold biographies deifying Napoleon as a modern demigod. Churches, once anti-revolutionary, now blessed the emperor. The victims became statistics. And the statistics were erased. But ghosts never remained silent. In letters preserved by Spanish monks, mothers wrote of burying their children with their own hands after bombardments. In a Portuguese village, a woman reportedly lived in total silence for 20 years after watching her 3 sons executed by mistake. Her final words before death were, "They're still standing, waiting to come back." Napoleon's war was not a sequence of battles. It was a social genocide, a methodical destruction of Europe's civil fabric. For every soldier killed in combat, there was a child buried anonymously. For every medal awarded, there was a village reduced to ash. And glory? Glory was built atop the rubble of those forgotten lives. Napoleon's empire was not forged by victory. It was molded in fire, fear, and the bones of innocence. While the world bowed to Napoleon's name, a shadow grew behind the gilded figure of the emperor. He was not merely a strategist, nor just a head of state. Napoleon was building himself into an archetype, a living myth. His image was carefully sculpted by artists, writers, and musicians paid by the regime, and every contradiction was buried under mountains of propaganda. The emperor transformed into a secular deity, and like every pagan god, he demanded blood sacrifices. Napoleon didn't just seek victory, he demanded worship. His portraits depicted him with golden halos, in postures reminiscent of apostles. His words were quoted as scripture. In schools, children were taught that he was the incarnation of reason. Even the most skeptical intellectuals surrendered to the dangerous charm of his rhetoric. It was a collective spell, a silent cult, a national madness. Newspapers were censored. Criticizing the emperor led to disappearances. Political prisoners were sent to oceanic fortresses or murdered with poison. Poets who dared mourn the war dead vanished overnight. Truth was molded like clay to suit the throne. An empire of false images built on real pain. In his speeches, Napoleon spoke of destiny, civilizing missions, peace through strength. But peace was a field of corpses, and civilization an excuse for domination. He compared himself to Alexander, Caesar, even Christ. Every military campaign was portrayed as an epic chapter in Europe's redemption. His failures were hidden, his atrocities denied. Yet the ghosts, always the ghosts, returned. They came back in soldiers' letters, widows' eyes, groans of the mutilated. There was something inhuman in how Napoleon dealt with death. To him it was a statistic, cold calculation. A battle that killed 30,000 could still be a glorious victory if his name was praised. A massacre was a footnote if the map changed in his favor. He slept well while men screamed in amputation tents. Upon learning of thousands dying during a river crossing, he reportedly said, "That's the price of eternity, the addiction that consumed him." He wasn't merely fighting nations, but time itself. Every monument erected, every coin minted, every street renamed was an attempt at immortality. He feared oblivion more than defeat. That's why he was cruel. That's why he was merciless. To be remembered, he needed to be absolute. In his inner circle, generals whispered about his coldness. One wrote, "Napoleon doesn't see men. He sees units. Every bayonet is a number, every death a comma in his speech." That dehumanization flowed from the top down. Officers mimicked his behavior. Compassion was weakness, mercy a dangerous luxury, and still he was loved, adored, mourned in the streets when departing for yet another campaign. Women saw him as a savior, men as a mirror of ambition. Even enemies admitted his charisma and intellect. Like all great monsters of history, Napoleon was mesmerizing, an abyss that drew you in before devouring everything. But even gods fall. And when the myth starts to crumble, all that remains is the monster who never felt remorse. The monster who marched across the bones of the forgotten. History teaches that every empire ends, but the fall of Napoleon was not merely the collapse of a ruler, it was the shattering of an illusion. The illusion that one man could mold the destiny of millions with an iron hand and golden promises. And when the castle began to crumble, it didn't fall all at once. It rotted from within. After the disaster of the Russian campaign, Europe awoke from its trance. The man who once seemed invincible now staggered. His allies deserted him. His once disciplined armies became bands of hungry specters. France, which had once thrown flowers at the emperor, now looked at him with fear. The squares filled with whispers. The people began to realize that the price of glory had been too high. In 1814, the Allies invaded Paris. Napoleon, surrounded, abdicated. He was exiled to the island of Elba. But even there, far from the continent, his ambition still burned, like buried coal. A year later he returned, in a fantastical march that would culminate in his final bid for greatness, the Battle of Waterloo. Waterloo was not just a defeat, it was a verdict. Nature, history, and the ghosts he himself had created gathered to bury his empire. Soldiers fought without faith, only from inertia. Many deserted. Others died without drawing a sword. And Napoleon, for the first time, saw the abyss not in his enemies, but reflected in himself. After the defeat, he was exiled again, this time to St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic, a remote rock where the winds howled like the screams of his former soldiers. There, Napoleon grew ill. His letters became confused. He raved, saw battles that didn't exist, spoke to the dead, reenacted imaginary victories before stunned servants. It is said that in his final days he begged for forgiveness in his dreams, that he screamed names of fallen generals, that he cried, that he feared the dark more than death. When he died in 1821, his body was examined in silence. Doctors cut his organs, searched for poison, but the real poison had been inside him all along. Absolute power. Napoleon was buried far from home, but his tomb, decorated in pomp in Paris decades later, never carried the weight of the forgotten bones. Millions died without a name. Their mass graves were covered, their stories lost, their families silenced, and the world moved on, as it always does. But the echo of those boots marching through mud still resonates in Europe's soil, because the bones beneath the glory do not rot. They whisper, they accuse, they remind us that every empire, no matter how mighty, is born and dies in the same dirt that covers the dead. Time, they say, heals all wounds, but some wounds refuse to close. Modern Europe is built on layers of silence, walls erected not with bricks, but with omissions. And among those forgotten cracks in history, the Napoleonic Wars still pulse. Like a latent infection, an ancient fever that returns in dreams, in books, in the shadows of monuments. France honors Napoleon with avenues, statues, coins, and military academies that still teach his tactics. He is celebrated as a national hero, a symbol of greatness and strategic genius. But rarely is the cost of his campaigns discussed. The mass graves, the orphans, the civilians burned in Spanish churches, the dead left in Egyptian sand, the frozen bodies in Russia. Silence became a historical pact. Museums display pristine uniforms, battle maps, framed portraits, but hide the screams from the fields. No button on a coat reveals how it was torn off a body by a crow. No rusted bayonet explains how it pierced the chest of a 16-year-old boy. Heroism is sterilized. Glory is embalmed. On battlefields today, bones are still found. Skulls, child-sized jaws, fingers with decayed rings. Archaeologists gather them with gloves, but few names are ever recovered. These remains, anonymous, return to the earth as they entered the war, ignored. In Germany, a dig uncovered more than 3,000 skeletons buried beneath what is now a children's park. They play atop bones, and it's not just the bodies that return, it's the ideas. The rhetoric of conquest, of national superiority, of redemption through war. In modern times, leaders invoke the spirit of Napoleon with different words, but the same hunger. The cycle continues, because when the past is forgotten, it repeats. In school books, we find summaries. Russian campaign, logistical failure. Nothing about cannibalism. Nothing about men begging to be killed. Egyptian campaign, scientific milestone. Nothing about fever-ridden nightmares. Nothing about group suicides. History is written by survivors, but published by victors. And the dead do not edit books. In modern soldiers' nightmares, psychologists identified traumas that mirror those from 200 years ago. War changes, but horror remains. The cold, the hunger, the guilt, the loss of identity. One American soldier returning from Iraq said he felt followed. In his words, he wears blue, is covered in mud, and asks if we're still fighting for glory. Collective memory is selective and cruel. But there are signs. Forgotten paintings in monasteries, field nurse diaries, names scratched into wood by fingernails. Each tiny record is resistance against forgetting, a warning, a mirror, and in that mirror, we see. that Napoleon's glory wasn't made of gold, it was made of bones. Bones that, even buried, still bleed. If the battlefield was a slaughterhouse, Napoleonic military hospitals were true laboratories of suffering. Medicine at the time, still primitive and shrouded in superstition, was unprepared for the brutality of modern warfare. And Napoleon, ever pragmatic, saw pain as an opportunity. The soldier's body was a tool to be used until exhaustion or death. A number, an experiment. Field surgeons operated in muddy tents with rusted instruments and no concept of sanitation. Amputations were performed in minutes, with a speed that bordered on the grotesque. There was no anesthesia, only bottles of alcohol and leather to bite. The screams could be heard miles away, blending with the moans of the dying on the fields. Secret. Medical studies funded by officers used wounded soldiers as test subjects. Some were subjected to experimental procedures without consent. Application of caustic substances, primitive transfusions, insertion of instruments for physiological observation. It was trench science, brutal, ineffective, and deadly. Field. Reports state that more than half of operated soldiers died from infection, though these numbers were erased from the reports sent to Paris. Hospitals were always overcrowded. Men agonized for days on straw mattresses soaked in dried blood, vomiting, delirious, calling out for mothers who would never come. The stench was indescribable: pus, feces, rotting flesh, despair. Rats wandered between the bodies like silent nurses. Often healthy soldiers were ordered to care for the wounded, and then fell sick themselves. Infection was inevitable. Death, a permanent guest. The role of military doctors was contradictory. Some were true angels in the darkness, fighting ignorance, improvising solutions, saving what they could with non-existent resources. But others became feared figures, almost demonic. Soldiers fled at the sound of their names. They preferred to die in open fields than under the knives of men who saw pain as research. And there was another field of experimentation: the mind. War trauma, still unnamed and misunderstood at the time, was viewed as cowardice. Men who trembled, cried, or refused to fight were punished. Some were hanged as examples. Others were subjected to shock treatments with improvised tools: hot iron, ice water immersion, beatings for re-education. All in the name of discipline. Napoleon knew and encouraged it. In private letters, he praised doctors who increased the army's efficiency by reducing recovery times. The emperor saw medicine not as salvation, but as machine maintenance. Life was irrelevant. Function was everything. Women who served as nurses, often soldiers' wives or conscripted nuns, faced horror as well. Abused, mutilated, killed once deemed useless, they were disposable pieces on a grotesque board. One French nun wrote in her diary, "I enter with a cross, leave with blood up to my elbows. No God looks at us here." Even today, military academies speak of Napoleon's logistics, his strategies, his campaigns. But no one mentions the endless amputations, the piles of limbs rotting beside tents, the men who went mad after being stitched together alive. That too was science. A science of death. Behind tactical maps, fiery speeches, and marble monuments were voices no one heard. Common soldiers, peasants dragged into bloody lines, forgotten women, children who died wide-eyed before fires that consumed their homes. This block is for them. For those who never became street names, but dust between paragraphs. Jacques Lemaitre, 19, a baker from Lyon, wrote a single letter to his mother before dying in Italy. In it, he said, "The flour slips through my fingers. Now I carry powder. Mother, there is no bread here, only screams." His body was never found. The letter was intercepted, copied by a chaplain, and preserved in a convent. Elena Montoya of Var. Zaragoza survived 3 French invasions. She hid more than 20 children in a cellar. feeding them with roots and dirty water. She was raped and executed by officers after refusing to reveal their location. The children escaped. One of them, grown, wrote, "My mother was a woman I never met but who saved me twice." Mikhail Ivanov was a 14-year-old Russian musician. He played flute to cheer up captured Napoleonic troops. He died trampled during a stampede. His instrument was found beside his body. The French buried him without a name, but an officer wrote in his journal, "The boy played as if there was still hope." War is made of these fragments, human echoes amidst political machinery, men who buried friends with their own hands, women who gave birth on battlefields, cradling their children for minutes before artillery took them. Children who never knew the name of the place they died. In a German prison camp, over 600 Frenchmen froze to death in the winter of 1813. They dug holes with their hands to keep warm, ate rats, leaves, and their own shoes. A note found on a skeleton's clothing read, "If someone finds this, tell Rose I dreamed of her until the end." No record remains of who Rose was, or who wrote it. Napoleon's wars left millions missing. People who vanished without a trace. Families waited decades for news. Many died not knowing that the emperor who sent them to war lived in luxury and wine during his exile. The glory of few upheld the silence of many. Records show soldiers invented families to stay sane, spoke with imaginary wives, wrote letters to children who didn't exist. Others carried symbolic objects, carved wood, shiny buttons, dried leaves as talismans against madness. These small gestures, forgotten by history, were their final acts of humanity in hell. Even today, archives remain incomplete. Museums show figures, maps, weapons. But where are the faces, the eyes, the hands that dug graves in the ice, that held dying friends, that trembled at the first kill? They're still here, in buried artifacts, in unsent letters, in the DNA of quiet hills. The true story of the Napoleonic era isn't in books. It's in the invisible scars of the continent, in the soil, in the blood, in the screams time couldn't silence. What remains when history's dust settles? When the drums fall silent, the banners are folded, and books close their chapters with dates and treaties? Silence remains, and in the case of the Napoleonic Wars, that silence is as heavy as the mud of the fields where thousands of men lay down to never rise again. This final block is not a conclusion. It is an echo, a call, because the bones are still here, scattered across Europe like forgotten signs of a tragedy masquerading as glory. Bones in Russian fields, bones beneath Germany's swamps, bones in French catacombs unrecorded. Bones that tell no tales of triumph, only of scars. Napoleon's wars marked the birth of the modern world. They redrew borders, inspired civil codes, redefined European politics. But they also left behind a trail of pain that still lingers. Not on the surface, but in what refuses to die. Collective trauma. The illusion that heroism can be built with bayonets. That freedom is born from submission. That the blood of others is an acceptable cost. Napoleon was, and remains, a symbol of human ambition. But his ambition didn't only build empires, it disfigured the continent's soul. The orphans grew up without history. The mutilated aged without honor. The abused women died without justice. And their names, those are the ones that should have been carved in stone. Today, when we walk through squares bearing his name, we should remember those who never had a gravestone. When we read about his battles, we must think of the letters that were never delivered. When we hear he was a genius, we must remember that genius without compassion is nothing but a refined executioner, because bones do not lie. They are not swayed by rhetoric. They do not kneel to glory. They simply remain, waiting, whispering, demanding that, for once, we look upon them and truly see what happened, and maybe in doing so, we can prevent another empire from rising on the same lies, on the same thirst, on the same bones. Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to our channel and like this video. Also, turn on the notification bell to be notified about our next posts. See you in the next video.